The night Lydia found out the truth, she was standing in her own kitchen, holding a dish towel, listening through a cracked window to her husband and his mother decide her future. She hadn't meant to overhear. She'd gone back inside to grab her phone, which she'd left on the counter after dinner, and the voices drifting in from the back porch stopped her cold. Nathan's voice, low and careful. Then Sandra's, quicker, more certain. The way Sandra always talked, like every sentence was a decision already made. Her parents are finalizing the sale by the end of the month, Sandra said. $240,000. That's what Lydia told you? More or less, Nathan said. She doesn't know the exact number yet. She doesn't need to. You just need to be there when it happens. Close, supportive. You know how to do that. Lydia stood very still. The dish towel was still in her hands. She could hear crickets outside, a neighbor's dog somewhere down the street, and the sound of her husband saying yeah in a quiet, agreeable way that she suddenly recognized she had heard 1,000 times before, always in response to his mother, never to her. She went back to the living room. She sat down on the couch. She did not pick up her phone. She had been married to Nathan for 6 years. They lived in a beige split level in Barrie, Ontario. Nathan's childhood home, which Sandra had temporarily handed over to them when they got married and had never actually left. Sandra had her own room upstairs, her own shelf in the fridge, her own opinions about how Lydia loaded the dishwasher, how Lydia dressed for church, how Lydia's mother talked too loud at the dinner table. For a long time, Lydia had told herself it was just an adjustment period. A lot of young couples lived with in-laws. It was practical. Sandra was lonely since Nathan's father passed. It would get better. It had not gotten better. But Lydia had still believed, underneath everything, that Nathan was on her side, that when it came down to it, he would choose her. She had believed that the way you believe in something you've never actually tested, with a kind of desperate, unexamined certainty. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark next to Nathan and listened to him breathe and thought about the words close and supportive, and you know how to do that. Lydia's parents, Frank and Carol, lived 40 minutes north in a small town called Collingwood. They'd bought a piece of land there in the 90s, before property values turned absurd, and they'd been sitting on it for years, renting it to a local farmer. Now the farmer was retiring, a developer had come calling, and Frank and Carol were, for the first time in their lives, about to have real money. They were private about it, the way people of their generation were private about money. They hadn't told many people. But Lydia had mentioned it to Nathan one evening a few months back, casually, the way you talk to your husband about your family's news. She hadn't thought twice about it. She was thinking about it now. The next morning she made breakfast as usual, eggs, toast, coffee. Nathan ate quickly, kissed her on the cheek, left for work. Sandra came downstairs in her housecoat and poured herself a coffee and said the eggs looked dry. Lydia said she was sorry about that. She watched Sandra settle at the kitchen table with her phone, scrolling, and thought, how long has this been going on? Not just the money, all of it. The comments about how Lydia kept the house, the subtle corrections in front of company. The way Nathan never said anything when his mother spoke to Lydia in a tone Lydia would have never used with anyone. How much of that had been orchestrated, and how much had Lydia just been too willing to explain away? She called her younger sister Becca from the car parked in a grocery store lot. I need to tell you something, Lydia said. And I need you to not say I told you so. Becca was quiet for a second. Then, okay, I'm listening. Becca had never liked Nathan. She'd said so once, early on, and Lydia had gotten defensive, and Becca had backed off and never brought it up again. That was the kind of sister Becca was. She'd give you her honest opinion once, and then she'd stand beside you in whatever you chose. She'd been at the wedding. She'd helped Lydia repaint the bathroom of the split level the first summer. She'd bitten her tongue at more family dinners than Lydia could count. Sitting in the parking lot, Lydia told her everything, the voices on the porch, the exact words she'd heard. The way Nathan had said, yeah, oh, Lydia, Becca said. Don't! I'm not! I'm just, okay, what do you want to do? That was the question. Lydia stared at the steering wheel. She thought about what she wanted, which was a thing she hadn't done in a while. She wanted the life she'd thought she was building. She wanted a husband who was actually on her side. She wanted to not be standing in her own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in a plan she hadn't been told about. None of those things were available to her right now. So she thought about what was. I don't want to blow it up yet, she said slowly. I want to know how far it goes first. Becca said, then let's find out. Over the next 2 weeks, Lydia paid attention in a way she never had before. She noticed that Sandra and Nathan had conversations she wasn't invited to. Low voices in the garage, a shared look across the table when Lydia mentioned her parents. She noticed that Nathan had started asking about Frank and Carol more often, in a way that felt almost performative. "How's your dad feeling? Is your mom still planning to go to Calgary to visit your aunt?" Very engaged, very interested. She noticed that Sandra had started being nicer to her. Not in a real way, there was no warmth in it, but the pointed comments had softened. Sandra complimented her cooking once. She asked about Lydia's work, which she never did. It felt like being handled. Lydia was 31 years old. She had a degree in accounting. She'd worked for a firm in Barrie for 4 years before Nathan had suggested, when they moved in together properly, that maybe she could take a break, just for a bit, while they got settled. The break had lasted 2 years. She'd let it happen because things had been hard and she'd been tired, and Nathan had been, for a while, genuinely kind about it. And Sandra had presented it as normal, as what wives did, as practical. She had a meeting with her old manager Theo on a Tuesday without telling anyone where she was going. She told Nathan she had a dentist appointment. Theo welcomed her back like she'd never left. They talked for an hour. By the time she got back to her car, she had a tentative offer, part-time to start, full-time by autumn if it worked out. She did not mention it at home. She also called her dad, not about the money, not directly. She told him she'd been thinking about things and wanted to catch up, and she drove up to Collingwood on a Wednesday and sat with Frank and Carol at their kitchen table and drank tea and tried to figure out how to say what she needed to say. In the end, Frank said it for her. "You seem like something's on your mind, sweetheart." Lydia wrapped both hands around her mug. "I heard something," she said. "Between Nathan and Sandra. I wasn't trying to, but I need you to know, whatever you're planning with the land, please don't discuss it with Nathan, and please don't let him be involved in any of it." Frank and Carol exchanged a look. "What did you hear?" Carol said. Lydia told them. Her mother's expression went very still. Her father set down his mug. "We haven't said anything to him," Frank said. "Beyond what you told him, we haven't spoken about the sale to anyone outside the family." "Good," Lydia said. "Keep it that way. And maybe talk to the lawyer about who has access to any paperwork." She drove home feeling shaky but clear-headed. Something had shifted. She'd spent years making herself smaller in that house, rearranging her feelings so they'd take up less space, trying to want less so there'd be nothing to fight about. She was done rearranging. The mistake Lydia made was thinking she had more time. She'd been careful. She thought she'd been invisible. But 2 nights after she visited her parents, she came downstairs for a glass of water around midnight and heard Nathan on the phone in the kitchen. The light above the stove was on. He was speaking quietly, but the house was quiet too, and she stopped on the bottom stair. "She went to see them," he was saying. "Yeah, Wednesday." "I don't know what she said." A pause. "I don't think she suspects anything. She probably just went to visit." Another pause. Longer this time. "I know. I'll handle it." Lydia went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Handle it. That was what she was to Nathan, apparently. Something to be handled. She had thought she was moving slowly and carefully, buying herself time to get her footing before anything broke open. She saw now that wasn't going to work. Whatever Nathan was planning, he was already adjusting. The timeline wasn't hers to set. The next morning, she called Becca again. "I need to move faster," she said. "How fast?" "Before the end of the month." Becca drove down on Friday. She told her own husband it was a sister's weekend, which was essentially true. She arrived at the split level with a bottle of wine and a calm expression that Lydia was grateful for, and while Sandra was out at her book club and Nathan was watching hockey in the basement, the two of them sat in the kitchen and made a list. It was a practical list. That was the only kind that would actually help. Lydia had opened her own bank account, separate from the joint one, at a different bank, weeks before. She'd been quietly transferring small amounts, nothing dramatic, nothing that would register, from the money she'd received from a small inheritance when her grandmother passed 2 years ago. That money had always been kept somewhat separate, technically in her name, but she'd been lazy about it, and Nathan had access through their shared accounts. Now it was somewhere he couldn't reach. She'd spoken to a family lawyer, Constance, whom Becca had found through a colleague. Constance was direct and unsentimental, and had been through enough of these conversations to not seem surprised by anything Lydia told her. She explained what Lydia was entitled to under Ontario family law, what the 6-year marriage meant for the split of property, and what Lydia could and could not protect if things became contested. "The house," Lydia said, meaning Sandra's house, Nathan's childhood home. "Is it in both your names?" "Nathan's name. Sandra transferred it to him when we moved in. Then it's complicated, but not impossible." "How long have you been contributing to household expenses?" Lydia had records. She'd started keeping them about 10 days after she overheard the porch conversation. pulling together old bank statements, credit card records, receipts she'd saved without knowing why, 4 years of grocery bills, utility payments, home repairs she'd organized and paid for with her own credit card, when Sandra had decided the kitchen needed new fixtures and Nathan had shrugged and said, "Whatever Mom wants." "Good," Constance said. "Keep everything." The list she and Becca made that Friday evening was about logistics, where Lydia would go, Becca's house in Guelph, at least at first, what she'd take, what she'd leave, how to do it in a way that was calm and legal and didn't give Nathan any reason to claim she'd acted erratically. "When?" Becca said. Lydia thought about it. "Next Saturday. Nathan works Saturday mornings. Sandra goes to her garden club at 9. I'll have 3 hours, maybe 4. Becca wrote it down. The week leading up to it was the strangest of Lydia's life. She made dinners and folded laundry and answered Sandra's comments about the dishwasher with the same patient politeness she always had. She sat beside Nathan on the couch on Sunday and watched a movie and let him put his arm around her and said nothing. He seemed relaxed. Whatever he thought he was handling, he seemed to think it was under control. On Wednesday, Frank called. The sale had been finalized early. The developer had moved quickly. The papers were signed. Frank and Carol had their own lawyer now, one who had been told specifically that Nathan was not to be involved in any communication about the transaction. "Are you okay?" Frank asked. "I'm going to be," Lydia said. She meant it. For the first time in a while, she actually meant it. On Friday night, Nathan asked her what she wanted to do for dinner on the weekend. "I'll be back from work by noon," he said. "We could drive out to that place in Oro you liked." "Sure," Lydia said. "That sounds nice." She didn't sleep much that night, not from fear, exactly. More from the strange sensation of being at the edge of something, the last hours before everything changed shape. Sandra left at 9:05, right on schedule, garden gloves tucked under her arm. Nathan had gone at 7:30. Lydia waited until 9:15, watching from the upstairs window, until Sandra's car disappeared around the corner, and then she went downstairs and started. She'd planned it carefully. 3 bags, one for clothes, one for documents and things that mattered, one for the smaller items that were unambiguously hers. Her grandmother's teapot, the framed photograph from her parents' 40th anniversary, the book she'd brought into the marriage. She moved through the house methodically, and she did not let herself get distracted by the things she wasn't taking, the accumulated years of a life she was walking away from. Becca arrived at 10 with her SUV and her steady, practical energy. She didn't say anything when she saw Lydia's face. She just picked up the first bag and carried it to the car. They were done in under 90 minutes. The house looked almost exactly the same. Lydia stood in the kitchen for a moment before she left, the dish towel hanging on the oven handle, the morning light coming in through the window over the sink. She thought about the night she'd stood there and heard everything, and had not yet known what she was going to do with it. She left her key on the counter. She did not leave a note. She sent Nathan a message from Becca's driveway in Guelph. "I know what you and Sandra planned. I know about the land and the money and the conversation on the porch. I've spoken to a lawyer. I'll be in touch through her. Please don't contact me directly." She turned her phone to silent and went inside. He called 11 times over the next 4 hours. Sandra called twice. Lydia watched the notifications appear and disappear and did not answer any of them. Becca made soup. It was a small, ordinary kindness that meant more than Lydia could have explained. The sound of someone moving around a kitchen without any tension in it, without any calculation underneath the surface. Lydia sat at Becca's table with a cup of tea and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was somewhere safe. The months that followed were not easy, but they were honest. And that was something Lydia had forgotten to value. Constance was efficient and unsentimental and good at her job. The separation process was difficult in the way these things are always difficult. Not because Nathan had much of a legal argument, but because he kept making emotional ones. He said she'd overreacted. He said she'd misunderstood. He said the conversation on the porch had been taken out of context, that Sandra was just talking, that he hadn't actually planned anything. Lydia let Constance handle it. She'd learned, over those 2 weeks of paying careful attention, that she didn't need to argue every point herself. She just needed to be clear about what she knew and consistent about what she wanted. She started back at the firm in September, part-time at first, like Theo had suggested, and it was hard some days to sit at her desk and remember that she'd once been good at this, that she still was, that the years of making herself small in that split level had not actually changed what she was capable of. By October, she was full-time. She found an apartment in Guelph, 2 bedrooms, a balcony overlooking a narrow street that got good afternoon light. She painted the second bedroom the color she'd wanted for years, a soft terracotta that Nathan had once said was too much. She put her grandmother's teapot on the kitchen shelf. She hung the photograph of her parents' 40th anniversary on the wall. Frank and Carol drove down to help her move in. Her dad assembled the bookshelf with his methodical, silent competence. Her mom made tea and said, very gently, that she wished she'd known sooner how things had been. I know, Lydia said. Me too. It wasn't a blame conversation. It was just the truth, and by now she'd gotten comfortable with truth, even the parts that reflected back on her own choices. She thought sometimes about the moment on the stair, the light above the stove, Nathan's voice, I'll handle it. She thought about all the small adjustments she'd made over 6 years to avoid conflict, to smooth things over, to not be the person who made everything difficult. She had genuinely believed, for a while, that she was being generous. That patience was a form of love. She understood now that there was a difference between patience and disappearing. The version of herself who had stood at that kitchen window, holding a dish towel, had already known something was wrong. She'd known it for longer than that, probably. She just kept reaching for another explanation, another reason to wait. She didn't blame that version of herself. She'd been doing the best she could with what she'd been willing to see. But the woman who drove up to Collingwood on a Wednesday and told her father the truth, that woman had made a different choice. A harder one. The one that actually changed things. Becca came over for dinner in November. They opened wine and cooked pasta, and talked for 4 hours the way they had when they were teenagers, before adult life had layered everything with obligation and careful self-editing. At one point Becca said, "You seem different," and Lydia thought about how to answer that. "I think I'm more like myself," she said finally. Becca nodded like that made sense. Lydia thought it probably did. She didn't know what came next. There were still things to settle, legally and emotionally, and she was in no hurry to pretend otherwise. But she was working again, and she had her apartment with its afternoon light, and she had her sister, and she had the quiet, solid knowledge that she had trusted herself when it counted. That, she was learning, was enough to build something from.